We all know there's a level of underrepresentation of East and Southeast Asian culture in the UK, but paradoxically, at the same time, certain aspects and facets of East and Southeast Asian culture, I would say, over-index. So, for example, anime from Japan, K-pop from Korea, these are relatively mainstream cultural phenomena that are recognized in the UK and have a good level of visibility. I think, especially as someone who is Chinese, the culture and the associations that China has in mainstream UK society tend to be quite negative. A big part of Eastern Margins' goal is to highlight the alternative, the underground, the subcultural aspects of East and Southeast Asian culture that don't get any kind of love and don't get any kind of visibility, with the idea to showcase like the nuance and the diversity that spreads throughout like all of our cultures.
Welcome back to another episode of Eastern Honeys. Today we have in the building an incredibly esteemed guest, David Zhou.
Hi Ron, how you both doing?
Very well, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Really excited for this.
To kick it off, as per, Isabelle, would you like to formally introduce our guest?
Of course. This is going to be low-key weird for you and I both because we are friends. So let's begin. David Zhou is the founder and director of Eastern Margins, a record label, platform and agency that champions alternative Asian culture through community events and parties, telling stories that represent the diversity of narratives and underground perspectives across East and Southeast Asian diaspora. David, who is of Chinese descent, is a DJ, performing under the moniker Triple Lumi. He was formerly a senior legal counsel at TikTok, responsible for providing high-level advisory and product counsel across gaming, music, and VR. Eastern Margins recently hosted Margins United at Earth Hackney, a first-of-its-kind Asian extravaganza that celebrated music, art, and food, as well as facilitating panels and workshops, all centered around good vibes and doing it for the culture. David Zhou, welcome to Eastern Honeys.
Thank you so much for having me. That is a great introduction. I think I might need to crib those notes and add it to my own website. So thank you for that.
In your own words, could you please introduce yourself and just describe your journey up until this very point?
The main way that I would describe myself is that I'm an organizer and storyteller. I think both of those things are descriptors that really resonate with me personally, and I think fit really well kind of my creative practice and what I've done on the business side with Eastern Margins as well. With Eastern Margins, it is quite a all-encompassing kind of business, community, collective, and it's quite chaotic at times, and that's something we embrace. You know, part of the philosophy of Eastern Margins is we have this idea called like red line, which is the idea that when you distort things, you create artifacts and mutations. And those artifacts and mutations are the really, really exciting things where innovation happens. That's a long way of saying chaos is embedded within what Eastern Margins is about. At a more practical level, that chaos manifests itself in we really chase down what we're passionate about, basically. There are no real restrictions on what we pursue as a collective and as a business. If it feels right and it's sustainable, we go for it. So that's how we kind of conceptualize things at Eastern Margins.
I love that because I feel like to really control chaos and thrive in it, you clearly need a team that is used to working in structure at a very high level of taste making with a really keen eye for culture, fashion, trends, sense, because when you know the rules, you can break them.
Yeah.
So even though it's chaotic, you clearly have organized a structure where everyone is free to explore and experiment. And for me, not knowing that much about Eastern Margins, apart from with my interactions through Isabelle and Jay, it comes across.
I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad it doesn't just come across as pure chaos.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. And What I like about Eastern Margins is from the outset, you really instill those values from like the inside as well. So it's like family and friends vibes throughout.
Yeah.
And I think that's why when you throw your events and parties, the energy is very palpable. Like everyone, it is a community first and foremost. And that's something I'm really grateful to have right now in this space.
We started it because we wanted to just showcase our culture with our friends. Literally a very, very, I would say like basic desire to be seen and felt in the scene that we were in, which is basically like the electronic music scene in the UK and London. We've actually kind of gone on that journey as a collective and as a people of, okay, we actually got a really passionate community of like-minded people. How do we convert that into something more? And how do we keep our core values and how do we not lose that energy that started us in the first place? I think we've taken a few steps in the last couple of years that have been really exciting to advance us on that journey, but it's something we're always really conscious about.
So Eastern Margins was a seed that came from this basic need for representation. And we definitely resonate with that because that's why we created this podcast.
Is a great way of putting it.
Now you're watering it, seeing the fruits of your labor. Up until that point, what was the experience of feeling that lack of representation? So from coming to the UK through to navigating that corporate environment.
To dive into the vaults, some deep lore about myself. I was born in China in a town called Nanjing. I moved to the UK when I was 8 years old, and I moved around a lot when I was a kid. So the first place I actually moved to when I moved to the UK was Dundee, and I lived in England, Scotland, Wales, all throughout the British Isles. So I think that's given me quite an interesting perspective on culture here and what it means to be diaspora. But I think one thing that's always stayed with me is that I think maybe because I moved around a lot when I was a kid, my Chinese heritage and identity was always a really, really strong anchor. Sometimes I hear diasporic stories of people, creatives, business people, anybody who perhaps say that growing up, they didn't feel like that connected to their culture and they felt more assimilated. I definitely understand that. For myself personally, like I didn't actually have that experience. Like I always felt really, really, really anchored to Chinese culture and my heritage. And maybe that's because like of all the displacement and moving around I experienced when I was a kid, I needed some kind of anchor. But the second anchor that I kind of developed, especially through like my teenage years, was really like music, and especially more subcultural music. So before I was like a raver, I was actually like an indie rock kid. So like full on
The skinny jean era.
in my skinny jeans, top man era.
Bombay Bicycle Club.
Libertines.
The skinny carrot.
Libertines
The skinny
for me.
carrot jeans from top man.
Did you have a side fringe?
I did. I had like one of those like skinny jeans, like Ralph Lauren jacket that I wore salmon pink all the time, basically.
Yes, to the salmon pink.
Exactly.
Yes, to Top Man.
So my one gig that I would absolutely love to go to, and I'm so sad, is Libertines Reunion 2015, Reading and Leeds. That's actually
Reading and
my
Leeds.
yeah. I think part of the reason now that I'm a bit older for why I think music was so important to me growing up, and especially rave and electronic music, was that I felt like that was the first part of UK society where in the darkness of wherever it was, you could kind of be just accepted as is. So I guess like my two anchors growing up in terms of identity was like my Chinese heritage and also like music. And really over time, I've been, I guess, promoting, organizing music in some form or another for about 15 years now, starting just before university, and started Eastern Margins after a little bit of a hiatus because I really, really wanted to connect those two parts of my identity, my Asian heritage, and then the resonance and the affinity that music, especially electronic music, had struck with me.
Harking back to that sense of community and communion.
Yeah.
sharing my partner Jay's love for electronic music and like parties. He shared with me once that he loves it because in the crowd and when you're sharing the energy and you're in the atmosphere of all these different people just vibing with you, he felt such a sense of belonging from his experiences growing up in the UK as a Korean British person. He was very othered and alienated and felt a sense of unbelonging within his British friendship group. And going to these parties afforded him that sense of, like you said, communion. I've been to EM events, and first and foremost, it's just vibes. It's vibes, energy, and like you said, the chaos and harnessed into joy and belonging.
Yeah, I think what's so powerful about dance music, electronic music, and I think actually like the UK and Britain does so well, is that sense of togetherness, unity that happens in the best scenarios. Like, I remember being like 16, 17, you know, and kind of like getting the train into London, because I lived outside of London at the time, to try and get into all these places, like underage, to try and go to all these parties. And it's like, you know, back then it was like all kind of very like forum based on the internet, formative forums like Dubstep Forum, these kind of things. So you learn about all of these kind of cultures and experiences just online, and then you have a certain perception of it. Then when you go and when you experience it in person, you just felt like you belonged. That words that you said about Jay, I think is so powerful. And I think the best forms of electronic music and dance music really like push that sense of belonging.
So alternative Asian culture is really important to you. And it was important to you to spotlight that within your work with Eastern Margins. Why is that?
We all know there's a level of underrepresentation of East and Southeast Asian culture in the UK, but paradoxically, at the same time, certain aspects and facets of East and Southeast Asian culture, I would say, over-index. So, for example, anime from Japan, K-pop from Korea, these are relatively mainstream cultural phenomena that are recognized in the UK and have a good level of visibility. I think, especially as someone who is Chinese, the culture and the associations that China has in mainstream UK society tend to be quite negative. So a big part of Eastern Margins' goal is to highlight the alternative, the underground, the subcultural aspects of East and Southeast Asian culture that don't get any kind of love and don't get any kind of visibility, with the idea to showcase like the nuance and the diversity that spreads throughout like all of our cultures. Because I think at one level you have those really highly visible cultural phenomena that tend to be from East Asia. But for example, like both of you being of like Filipino like heritage, like there's so limited understanding of that here. Like people wouldn't even be able to like probably, I guess like most people on the street wouldn't even be able to name like the language or let alone like a dialect of like the Philippines. And it's all kind of just like this big homogenous ball that has like anime-fied, kawaii aesthetics when people think of like Asia or like East and Southeast Asia. And I think what we want to do with Eastern Margins is we don't really want to, because I don't really believe in educating people through like criticism to be like, okay, like you need to do this or whatever. What we want to do is like celebrate and elevate. So basically showcase stuff so that people think this is actually really cool. Like maybe I should learn more about Budots from the Philippines. Maybe I should learn more about like third wave Chinese cinema. Maybe I should learn more about like Wiener House from like Vietnam. And that's kind of the angle that we want to take. And when we say alternative Asian culture, that's what we mean basically.
I love the idea of like unraveling that homogenous ball of Asia
Yeah,
because
exactly.
even the differentiations between East Asia and Southeast Asia versus intra-Southeast Asia is so different. And
exactly.
I just love the way it's like Budots. An event is happening. It's like, educate yourself and come through. It's not like this was born of, you know, it's not forceful education in that sense.
And what gets me really, really optimistic actually, and I'm a big proponent, is I feel like the digital social media revolution is, especially with like the move to short form video, is actually incredibly like democratizing. Because, for example, right, let's take Budots. Let's like hone in on that. So like Budots is basically a Filipino electronic music subgenre, typically 140 BPM, created about 2 decades ago from kind of like a local dance scene, Davao City. And that...
Shout out Davao.
Yeah, exactly. Like previously, scenes, cultures, sounds like that would have required gatekeepers here to basically like propagate them. You know, the whole like world music thing. Like we've been somewhere exotic and we like found this exotic sound and we're gonna like bring it here. But with the advent of like the way that social media now works, we see stuff like Budots becoming a global sound just through the power of basically like the algorithm, for want of a better way to put it. And actually what I love about it is like, now this like Budots song that's gone really viral, like Emergency from like DJ John Ray, that's been presented to people actually without gatekeepers. It's just quite a one-to-one communication of culture, and people are allowed to kind of like learn about it at their own pace. And that actually makes me really, really, really optimistic, because for me, it's a level of the playing field. It's like, can you capture people's attentions? And I think when you level the playing field, the culture, especially the music and sounds we have at East and Southeast Asia, can go toe-to-toe with anyone, as we're seeing. So yeah, that's just like a little aside, but I'm actually really optimistic, and I have a level of kind of excitement about kind of like the changes in social media and the way digital information is disseminated.
It's so refreshing to hear you like speak in this way, because I think we were unpacking female Asian identity yesterday on an episode, and a lot of it was about how there are so many fixed binaries in British media, specifically for the Filipino woman. It's like we're either a beauty pageant Miss Universe winner, or we are a caregiver, nurse, or some kind of like victimized domestic helper, and there's no in between. There is no spectrum of representation or nuance that actually represents who we are as individuals. Just taking it back to before all of Eastern margins and maybe like your more corporate professional workspace, navigating those, and as a British Chinese man, what has been your experience of, I suppose, at a space level, like stereotypes, or having to subvert, or even just like challenge, or is it just the act of being yourself in those spaces that have worked to help with that?
Prior to Eastern Margins, and semi-parallel to when Eastern Margins was first conceived, I was working as a lawyer in various companies. The legal profession is a profession where there is a sort of an expectation that people who are East Asian might pursue that career. That's a really, 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 really fancy way of saying like your parents want you to be a lawyer basically when you grow up, right? In a lot of ways, like, yeah, I kind of fulfilled part of that. But I think what's really interesting about that world and like the legal corporate world is that I would actually say in those worlds, there are less expectations, and there's actually more freedom of identity. When you become a lawyer, like no one is super gassed to be a lawyer, you know?
Like, are they not?
It's not the same as if you want to be an artist, you want to be a musician, where your sense of personal identity is so tied up in your profession. people who are lawyers, I think, only give like maybe like 50, 60% of their personality into their profession. Whereas like in the industry we are now, you're like 110% in. Every fiber of who you are, how you project yourself professionally, personally, externally, internally, has to resonate with like your mission and your career. Whereas like in the legal profession, the corporate world, I don't know them as like other lawyers. I might know them as like, they're like a really keen like marathon runner, or they're like a really, really like passionate cook. You're less defined by your profession in those corporate environments. There's a lot of stigma attached with it, especially now in the creative industries. It's kind of, I think there's a stigma of being like, okay, if you're not 100% in, then it's not worth my time. Like, you're not serious about it. Spending a good portion of my formative years in those like environments, I actually have like quite positive things to think about it. Like, we all know the negative things about that environment, but I think sometimes people can put the creative industries too much on a pedestal and forget there are also good reasons for why people do other things as well.
Totally.
So,
speaking on a more positive note, how do you think your experiences as a legal professional within the music and product space kind of equipped you to really take Eastern Margins off to the moon?
I'd probably say the main couple of things that I learned from that I also carry into Eastern Margins is when I was working in the legal profession, I was mostly in like startup world. There is a real culture of basically like moving fast and like iterating. The idea of like, it's better to do it and to break it, because then at least you know like where you shouldn't go, rather than kind of being very slow and being very static. And I think that holds just as much weight, if not more, in the cultural and creative world. Like, have to be able to move fast and be almost like welcome and adaptable to change. Especially with the way like information is disseminated these days, moves so fast. To lean into it and to recognize that culture moves fast, and so should the participants of culture, I think that's actually quite liberating. To be like, tomorrow, what I know now probably is not going to be irrelevant. That's something I've taken a lot from like my professional background. Probably hear it in like the music of Eastern Margins. It's all a bit fast and it all sounds like you had like a bit of a sugar rush. And that's because that is kind of like our cultural hypothesis. It's like, things move quickly, don't fight it, lean into it.
So on that note about creatives and artists having their craft and practice so tied into their identity and sense of purpose, I really resonate with that as an artist myself. I used to place a lot of value in the work that I created, the magazines that I had my work featured in, the clients and the teams that I work with. As a DJ and an artist yourself, can you share any of your own experiences on that?
I think one thing that was really quite liberating for me when it came to this idea of identity and how much is tied up in your like professional output is actually just the idea of like, it's not that deep. It's not that serious. When you realize like your professional or your creative output isn't necessarily 100% embodiment of who you are as a person, that can be quite scary, because it can feel like you're decoupling from your true self. But what I'd actually say is it reduces the inhibitions and it makes it more intuitive. What's in your mind comes out more. And I think that's something that really, really inspires me about a lot of the electronic music genres that we push in Eastern Margins. So genres like Budots in the Philippines, we've spoken about, Manyao in Malaysia, like these genres are actually quite formulaic. And I think people, especially Western music industry, have a perception that these forms of music are quite simplistic. Therefore, the artists are quite simplistic. But that's not true at all. The artists that we're working with, like, they have a full understanding of what's going on in like Western dance music history. But because they're creating music that has a certain formula and a certain genre to it, that kind of restriction or that kind of separation from like 100% of their creative practice allows them to be a bit like more kind of like creative I would say. Sometimes that like restriction of being like, it's not that serious, it's not that deep. It doesn't have to be like 100% who you are. Actually allows you to be a bit more free.
Speaking on decoupling, I really like that idea of freedom and inhibition. But for you, where's the line between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation? Because for me, it's rooted in context, credit, and homage, and acknowledgement. But what are your thoughts on artists who redefine themselves with every new album, for example, like doing a country album one day and then a rap album the next? And what are your thoughts on, say, like ESEA artists delving into country, delving into a genre that is not typically their own?
I'm generally actually like pretty gung-ho about it. The reason why I'm relatively gung-ho, and by gung-ho I basically mean like, it's not something that I think the line between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation for me, it's not something that I think is that important. Is because for me, I actually think like the authentic form of a culture is always going to win out. Someone who doesn't understand the culture, trying to make an imitation of it, is always in the medium to long term gonna be like beaten out by the true authentic form of that culture. So I actually think in a lot of ways like that, let's call it like cross-cultural pollination. So like no kind of like categorization of whether it's like appropriation or like appreciation. That like cross-cultural pollination, I think if it raises like awareness and it raises like dialogue, I think overall it's a good thing. And I think, yeah, there are definitely a lot of negatives. Like you see when people just have no understand. Let's take like world music as a whole genre, right? Like people who kind of come in and just like, you know, remove the context from something and then give it a new context. That's obviously a negative and it's unfair and it disproportionately benefits one group of people and it disproportionately like detriments another group of people. But I think over time, like people are clever and have more access to more information than ever. They know where the real culture is. They know where the real communities are. And I think that will ultimately win out, actually.
Yeah, never underestimate the intelligence of your audience.
Exactly. I think people know. Like, people know if someone is being inauthentic and doesn't understand the culture as much anymore. Like, if you put, like, you give, like, a 15-year-old kid with an iPad and you're like, okay, let me show you some stuff. They already have such a finely attuned sense of, like, culture that they know, like, this is not cool. Yeah. It's not legit. Like, their barometer is actually, like, super, super, super sharp already.
We were having like a similar conversation yesterday where it's like with AI being used to support creative workflows, etc., produce new things, what AI doesn't have is the human exposure over a long body of time to what taste is, to what sounds good, what is feels good, what's elevated, and that's the distinction. Like it always requires sense check, vibe check from an expert.
Exactly, because culture at the end of the day is like ultimately like purely subjective. There's no numbers that can measure cultural impact. Like we like always can like try and put numbers on it, right? But like you can't. Like it's impossible. It's a purely subjective thing. I think subjectivity is something that is always like so human. Like so,
You can't quantify self-expression either.
Yeah, exactly.
So you raised an interesting point earlier about AI and being like everything is digestible, everything is accessible. I sometimes work in teaching spaces and it is interesting because my students, they're like, I love, you know, football core, cottagecore, and also like the coquette aesthetic.
Yeah.
I like to challenge that. Music, self-expression, and fashion is so wrapped up in legacy. Yeah. And that is, I believe, how you build true authenticity and culture through those veins. And I did read somewhere that, you know, where humans are always perceived to be social creatures. Yeah. But in fact, we're actually creatures of culture, therefore community and communion. So speaking On the parallels between music and fashion, can you tell us the importance of championing diversity in creative industries? Do you have experiences in your career that spark this drive to represent the diaspora more? Because music and fashion on the outset seems very diverse and representative, but with the conversations I've had with other creatives in the industry, it's actually a different story.
Yeah. I think, to be quite almost like analytical about this, I think with culture, as with any other form of business, organizing anything, any collection of humans, the output depends on what the input is. If our goal is to move culture and to push it forwards, you need to have a diverse input to ensure a diverse output. Like, no group of people, no collection of people is able to kind of like create more than the sum of their experiences, unless they're like some kind of like omniscient being, you know? And like
Shout out God.
yeah. Shout out God. Yeah.
G.O.D.
But like, yeah, so I think diversity of everything, diversity of backgrounds, of orientations, of professions is so important to ensuring that the output that you're creating, your creative output, your artistic practice is actually like innovative, experimental, and boundary pushing. And it's like, on a very practical level, that's something we as Eastern Margins have had to learn a lot as well. And we're constantly learning about. Because I think it's very easy to work with people who are like you. Because, you know, that's who you're comfortable with. That's who you can have a conversation with. That's your social circle. But actually, that doesn't push you. You need people in your circle who make you a bit uncomfortable. You need people to you who are different in whatever form. Because those differences, I think, create, like going back to that Eastern Margins concept of like redlining, that creates like those distortions, those ripples in the culture that creates like mutations. So I think diversity is super important, and more specifically within diversity, it's about people who make you a bit uncomfortable, actually, in one way or another, who challenge you in some way.
On challenges, gatekeepers, and discomfort.
Yeah.
Historically, gatekeepers in this country are of a certain ilk. What has been the reception in those circles that you've obviously operated in before to Eastern Margins and what you're doing?
From the previous industries that I've been in, like the legal industry, there's actually, I would say, a really sweet and naive support of like what we're doing. Right. You know, people like my previous colleagues or people that I've worked with, they definitely don't understand what I'm doing, but they are very like supportive of it, actually. The current music industry, the current creative industries, that's actually where a lot of like the challenges like still lay. There's a reason why things are the way they are, and some people benefit a lot from the status quo. To give you a couple examples, right, they're very practical. Digital streaming platforms, so Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, etc., they group all of their music by geography. Okay. So music and how it's disseminated to consumers, the number one most important thing actually beyond even like genre or sound is like language and geography. So within the streaming platforms, there is a UK and Ireland team, and they focus on artists, culture, music from here, which, you know, does make sense in a lot of ways. We have to give a platform to support UK and Irish artists who are here already, diasporic artists from the ESEA diaspora who are here. But that way of organizing culture has a massive barrier to entry for someone outside of like this geography. If you are like an English language singing artist from Malaysia or from China, breaking into UK and Ireland is incredibly difficult because it's ring-fenced in such a way that like it's geographically ring-fenced.
On the pod, we've had Jason Kwan, we've had Kai Wei, we've had Murray Music, who has worked on our jingle, produced our jingle.
Nice, amazing, yeah.
And it's really lovely to witness that, like Jason, Kaiway, all of the musicians that have been on the pod, they've really brought in their culture and their music.
Also, I like be yourself too. It's not necessarily that. It's not just your culture. It's also just you.
Exactly. You know, on that trope of like the Asian diaspora, it's not a monolith.
Yeah.
Our jingle sounded very tropical vibes, and the Philippines is one big fiesta. Feedback was, it doesn't sound very Asian. And we were like, but what is Asian? Because there's jungle Asian, flip-flop Asian, there's, you know.
It's rich and vibrant, but there's also, we want to showcase our culture, Filipino culture within the jingle specifically.
Yeah.
So on the subject of Chinese culture, your cultural background, when you decided to leave a corporate career behind and forge your path in music, what was the reception from your parents and family around that?
They obviously hated it, you know? Like, I'm sure a lot of people watching also have like Asian parents. Like, my dad didn't, when I told him that I was going to leave legal career and start my own business, I'd already done it. Like, I already had like handed in my notice like 3 months ago. And I only told him when it was basically like done, because I know he would hate it. And, you know, when I told him, didn't speak to me for 2-3 months after that. So quite I would say probably like a expected reaction, nothing surprising there. I think that's probably something like a lot of like East and Southeast Asian creatives, like we were saying, like off camera, like have experienced in their lives in some way. And I think it's actually like quite telling how a lot of East and Southeast Asian creatives tend to be a bit older than their counterparts. Because we've had like maybe like a whole other career before we've really like set off on this journey. I think on that, I don't harbor any like ill will to, or any kind of like feeling some kind of way to that aspect of our culture, because I understand it. You know, the generation above us, for a lot of them, they still remember a time where they were hungry. They still remember a time where they might only have one meal a day. So the amount of progress that generation has seen in their lifetime is incredible. And they've made a lot of sacrifices to get to where they are now. And it takes a lot for them to digest and understand why you wouldn't like hold on to it, why you wouldn't grab onto that progress.
Safety and security.
Exactly. So I don't feel like any kind of ill will, and I don't have any criticism for that aspect of the culture. I think it's just kind of a thing that exists. I think also the other angle that's quite interesting and I think is often less talked about is like the class and economic considerations, where for a lot of us as diaspora and immigrants, a lot of us are first generation or second generation, especially in the UK. And actually the safety net, the economic safety net is often not there or very, very thin. It's hard to be like, okay, I'm going to become capital C creative, have focus on my artistic practice, because a lot of people don't have any like kind of like financial safety net, don't have any kind of like backing that they can like fall on to just be like, I'm going to pursue my like artistic kind of like endeavors. And that often means that you have to establish another career first to build yourself that safety net, to build yourself that stability before you can jump into what is like a very inherently uncertain industry. And I think that is that class angle and the intersection between class and like ethnicity and heritage is often one like we don't talk about consciously, but I think it's super important. Like we're not often just doing careers before or making that transition because our culture demands it, but it's actually like for class and money reasons that a lot of us do this. Yeah, I think that's something that is, I want to kind of tease out.
We definitely address class, privilege, access to opportunity by virtue of your passport.
Yeah.
All of those things are so important to address because, again, spectrum of representation and nuance. I loved what you said about often Asian creatives who've transitioned being a bit older. Because I think, especially in the West, there's such an obsession with youth. An obsession with youth, emergence, breakthrough, this sense of, and it's like older people reinvent themselves too. Like I watched my dad reinvent his life at 50, take on a new business. So many role models in my own family have reinvented and grown into success from 40, 50, 60 plus. And I just think we are so limitless as people. And culture, again, is an addition, it's not a subtraction. So ending on a positive note, we would love to hear from you. We're asking this of all our guests. If you were to write a letter to the diaspora, what would it say?
Be free and go for it. I think, especially as diaspora living in the UK, there's a lot of expectation, a lot of baggage, a lot of pressure on us from various different sources, be that family, financially, or culturally. And I want us to just go for things and to be free from those things and to push on. And I think that is scary. It's really scary because in a lot of ways it goes against how we're brought up and it goes against our lived experiences.
Sometimes you're the first.
Yeah, exactly. But what I think is important to remember as well is there are people that have come before us. There are going to be plenty of people that come after us. We're just one thread in a wider cultural tapestry. So actually going for it, being free, making mistakes doesn't matter that much in the grand scheme of things. It's not that deep. So let's go for it. Let's try things. Let's fuck it up. Let's make mistakes. Let's be a bit chaotic. That's what I would put in the letter, basically.
XOXO David.
Yeah.
Love that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that amazing answer.
Thank you so much for having me on.
So before we close the episode, we would just love to thank you, David, and also David's gorgeous garms and my gorgeous garms.
Yeah, shout out Nicole Tree and Lydia Bolton, who I'm repping right now, basically.
Yeah. Friend of the pod.
Friend of the pod, Nicole Tree. And also, I would like to shout out Rise United, an ESEA football group. Don't ask me about the offside rule. My favorite footballer is Victoria. We love to represent, we love to celebrate and truly back the community. So do check out Rise United for good vibes and athleticism. And also Nicole Tree and Lydia Bolton for just incredible, sexy garments.
So to close out the show, if you just want to let the good people know where they can find you, what you've got coming up.
Time to plug. Yeah. Eastern Margins on all platforms. Very, very simple. Find us on the streaming platforms. Find us on socials. In terms of what we got coming up, the big project that we're really excited about is our compilation album, Redline Impact. So shout out Jex all the way in Melbourne, who's been crafting this for a year, sculpting this. But this is our big compilation album that showcases the full breadth of our roster and our sound. So go check it out, go run up the numbers. You can also find my own stuff at Triple Lumi on Insta, SoundCloud, all of that stuff.
If you related to this episode, if you have any questions you'd like answered for next season, give us a shout. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.